Tidy First with Kent Beck.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, which is a full-service software architecture and engineering firm serving companies that are building mission-critical software systems. We're in the second year of my architect forums. Sign-ups for the next session are up, and if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with peer architect leaders, just sign up at the link in the show notes. And we've also launched a new software leadership forum for managers and executives and technical executives who oversee software engineering groups. So if this fits you, or if you'd like your boss to come, then please pass the word. It'll focus on topics specific to management leadership. So we have the architect forum, and we also have the software leadership forum for managers. And signups are at the link in the show notes. And for those looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. Today, we have an interview from Kent Beck. He was on the show in early 2024, but this topic is so universal. And if you've heard this interview before, then you are dismissed. But have a great day. Let's get into it. Now, Kent Beck is one of the original signers of the Agile Manifesto. He's the author of the Extreme Programming book series and rediscoverer of test-driven development, TDD, and also an inspiring keynote speaker. And just personally, I read his TDD book some 20 plus years ago. So grateful for having Kent on the show. Kent, how are you, sir?
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I'm doing well today. How are you?
I'm great. Well, I think that I belong to what's now a generation of software developers who probably started out and worked at companies that didn't have very good code hygiene, and automated testing was one of those. It was the beginning of automated builds and what would become continuous integration. A lot of the technical practices in extreme programming, besides iterations and smaller batch sizes and things like that. And you were an early publisher and an early teacher for what I would say my generation. I started in 97. And I was roaming through the wilderness for a few years before I realized, okay, this is not how software should be built. And so I want to back up because a lot of people have read your work, but there's probably some younger ones who haven't, just because they've only been in the field for a few years. What was happening in your career that maybe led you into, let's talk about extreme programming first, led you into this group of technical practices where you realized, okay, this stuff is kind of necessary?
So the early part of my career, I spent trying to obtain technical mastery of my tools. I thought if I just become a virtuoso programmer, then my projects will be more successful.
Mm-hmm.
And what I discovered was you can be a bad enough programmer that your projects fail, but you can't be a good enough programmer that your projects succeed, because there's all this context around programming. And if I don't pay any attention to the context, like your relationship with the rest of the business and your relationship with customers and your relationship with other developers, all those things have a huge impact on whether your programming efforts amount to anything or not. And you can get better and better at programming forever, but not be more and more successful. So extreme programming came out of that examination of saying, well, what are the things, if I look around at the context for programming, what are the things that tend to cause it to go well? And then how far can we crank that? So something like continuous integration came out of noticing that the more frequently people integrated, and this is back in the day when you might, on a big project, you might integrate once a month or multiple months. And the more frequently people integrated, the smoother those integrations went. because everybody was trying to avoid integrations because they were so incredibly painful. You'd code for 3 months and then you'd spend a month integrating, just trying to get stuff to build. And then you'd spend 2 more months debugging, except of course you're supposed to be continuing making progress. So you're making the whole thing worse in that cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So the extreme programming was kind of push the reset button and say, all right, let's take all these things that we know seem to make programming more significant, the context, and we'll just crank them up as far as we can go. And any idea that's successful has a big element of luck and timing involved. And the luck and timing there was the internet was obviously going to be a big, big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But people could look at it and say, yeah, but if I do this conventional waterfall stuff, I'm going to miss the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And so people were desperately looking for an alternative that didn't just sound like, well, let the programmers do whatever they want and we'll get whatever we get. They wanted an alternative to that. And there was XP. And so people latched onto that, and the rest, as they say, is history.
A lot of history, a lot of water under the bridge, a lot of things have happened, and automated testing is, while it's not as widely spread as it should be, it's not such a novel idea. It's considered like, oh yeah, everybody agrees that it's a good practice, but then certain people don't do it. They just apologize for not doing it. They're not arguing against it like I remember, a long time ago.
Correct, because you can't trust programmers to write tests because they'll just assume everything works.
Yeah.
Well, no. If you set up the incentives that way, maybe some people will act that way, but that's not the programmer's problem, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Right. So a long time has happened, and you've joked before that you're the first signer of the Agile Manifesto because they put it in alphabetical order by last name. So congratulations.
We put it alphabetically on purpose because that was a room full of people who all wanted to be first, and Mike Beadle lost. Rest his soul. And I won out of that whole group of people. So yes, I'm not just a signatory. I'm the first signatory, but only alphabetically.
So there's a lot of conversations that have happened since the Agile Manifesto, and conversations about iteration size and practices and ceremonies and like planning poker and all these different types of meetings and what to call things. And so from your perspective, after all this time, what would you say are the absolutely critical practices that have stood the test of time, that are not like, oh, somebody thought this was a good idea, so let's have this type of thing, but it's kind of like the bare minimum. These are absolutes now, regardless of what you want to call them. These are the set that have kind of weathered the storm in the arguments and are now, in your mind, just absolutely non-negotiables.
I don't think I can list practices.
Okay.
I can list, and the problem with listing practices is people can do them for the wrong reasons, do them badly, proclaim success, and then wonder why things are going haywire. I think the values are a better place to start. Although just talking about values, again, you can do anything and claim that you value communication.
Yeah.
So I recently managed a team for a year that's building some critical infrastructure, and we didn't check off the list of XP practices at all.
Okay. Every
Monday we'd get together, and by we, I mean the whole team, the users, their managers, our managers, the individual contributors. We would get together and say, what do we need to do this week? What's the most important thing to accomplish this week? And then we'd go through a conversation and decide what to do that week. And on Friday, we would get together and say, how'd that go? And to me, that's the fundamental heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
So, within that, sure, lots of tests got written, lots of refactoring happened. There was some pairing, there was some solo, there was some mobbing. What made us effective wasn't those practices. It was the responsibility we're taking to the users of the software. And in that case, it was, we gated whether people got paychecks or not. Millions of people got paychecks. And taking that responsibility seriously means that you do lots of stuff. Are you gonna write tests as a programmer if you're actually responsible for that? Oh, yes, absolutely. But the tests aren't the point. The responsibility is the point.
Yeah. So you mentioned a week, and there's a lot of debate with XP and Scrum over the size of the iteration. Has that become a normal length, or do you have all kinds of varying lengths still to this day between projects?
I don't know. People seem to have settled for going slow enough that 2 weeks is the quickest possible loop with their customers, and I think that's that shows a lack of ambition. There's a reason that the 7-day week, it's one of the few really universal human, like it doesn't matter where you go, a week's a week.
Yeah.
So let's take advantage of that instead of trying to make up for, what we're worried about, or, listening to our fears. Oh, we couldn't possibly get anything done in a week. Well, how about if you do get something done in a week?
Yeah.
How about that? So that's definitely an XP thing, to try to cut with the grain instead of against the grain. So you got this week, and everybody rules their lives around it. I love having a week as the basic cycle, because on Monday, I'm coming in like, what are we going to accomplish this week? Then we have here's what we think we're going to accomplish, and we know things are going to change and it'll be fine. And then on Friday, we get this sense of closure. What did we accomplish? And, looking back, is that what we wished we had worked on?
Yeah.
Or did we know better at some point? Now are we going to make better decisions in the future? And then you can have a whole weekend free, recharging your batteries.
Yeah.
About midday on Sunday, I'm starting to get hyped up again. And, by Monday morning, I'm ready to eat raw meat. So, I don't understand using anything else as the basic cycle for development.
Well, it seems, from where I sit, it seems like the dust has settled, whereas there were a lot of arguments about that. 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, all that. So good. Now, you've written another book. You've written quite a few books, but your latest book is called Tidy First, because it has a question mark at the end. So I have to say Tidy First, a personal exercise in empirical software design. And, it's an easy read. And so just a question from O'Reilly. What made you think, what? It's time for my next book, and this is the topic I want to write. What was that inspiration?
Well, I didn't think of that. I thought that in 2005. This book took me 18 years to write.
Okay.
And I was on a panel with Ed Jordan, rest in peace, and Larry Constantine. And we were talking about their book, Structured Design, which had introduced the concepts of coupling and cohesion. Yeah, you got the green book right there. Exactly. I actually have 2 copies of it, one of which is signed by Ed and Larry. So I'm very proud of that. And the problem with that book is it's for a generation or 2 before me in technology. But the truths they speak of absolutely still hold to this day. So that's part of it. Is I wanted to take that material and bring it to a new audience. The leverage of it, one is, we talked about testing. People have real hard time with testing. Oh, I write these tests and then I can't change anything because a million tests break. So I was a waste of time to write the test. Well, it's not the only way to write tests, but more importantly, it's not the only way to design software so that you can write tests that are sensitive to changes in behavior and insensitive to changes in structure. So software design is a critical skill to testing, which is a critical skill to taking responsibility for the quality of your work. It's also a critical skill to the long-term viability and value of software, because if you improve the design of the software, it means that you get more options for what you can implement economically in the future. If you do design in this empirical style, a little at a time, you also improve the economics of the software because you're spending money later and you're earning money sooner, which finance tells us is equivalent to earning more money and spending less money.
Time value of money.
So everything aligns with software design being an important skill. The first words out of my fingers when I started to write the book, though, were software design is an exercise in human relationships. And I thought, what in the world does that mean? But, I've been preparing for, at that point, when did I write that? Probably 3 years ago. So, I've been preparing for 15 years to write that line, and out it popped. And what I realized once I got over my shock at what I had written was, no, that really is, there are certainly technical aspects of it. And in the book, we talk about coupling and cohesion. And in the future, we'll talk more about the fundamental laws of software design, because it is a natural process in the end. So there are these technical aspects to software design, but in the end, the human aspects completely dominate. You have to be good at the technical stuff, but again, that's not enough. If you use an API that I supply and I want to change it and you get all huffy and now you don't trust me and I gave you a bunch more work to do and now our communication breaks down, my conclusion is that I, as a designer, have made a mistake. I have a responsibility not just to the health of the software, but to the health of the relationships with the people who are using the software. And so I, as a designer, it's not enough for me to improve cohesion and reduce coupling. I need to do it in a way that builds stronger relationships over time instead of deteriorating them. That goes at all scales. So Tidy First is the first smallest scale book, and it's about this moment when you say, I got to change this code, but it's so messy. It's so messy that it makes it hard to change. Do you tidy first? And that's where the question mark in the title comes. By the way, pro tip to authors: don't put punctuation in titles. It's just going to be a pain in the butt forever. Anyway, so
none of your URLs work. It's a query string.
The smallest scale is just this relationship with yourself, as software design as self-care. Then the next book, which I'm noodling on now, not actively writing yet, but definitely working on, is about software development within a group of people who are changing the software. So we're all geeks. My design decisions affect your work. So how are we going to continue to work together and improve the design as we go along? How are we going to build those relationships? That's book 2. And so we're talking about slightly larger changes to the software. Part of the philosophy in Tidy First is you can make large changes in small, safe steps.
Yeah.
And the further up you scale, and this is stuff I observed while I was at Facebook, the larger you scale, the more important it is to take small, safe steps. So people who say, oh, I can just, replace this system with this other system, and then you just flip a switch and it just cuts over. That maybe works on a small scale, but it doesn't work. The more significant your software is, the less likely that kind of approach is to work.
Right.
So the second scale is among the geeks cooperating on the software, how are you going to make large changes in small, safe steps in ways that enhance relationships instead of tax them? And then the third book is we're basically back to the topic of extreme programming, which is there's this huge gap between business and technology, where it seems like the incentives are wildly divergent. Even if long-term we can say, yeah, we're all looking to advance a mission, we're all looking to IPO and retire. Like there is some incentive far out in the future where we're going together. But right now, I talk to people who where the product manager says, what are you doing refactoring? Knock that off. I'm thinking, wow, that just doesn't seem like a decision that's yours to make, sir.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna save that for last. That conversation between business and technology. I think that software design has a critical role to play, done well and done mindful of the effects on the relationships between people with wildly different perspectives on the software as we see at the highest levels.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question?
It does. It does.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
The table of contents of Tidy First, I'm going to have to say it that way. The table of contents, has some items that I think a lot of developers have heard before. They've heard of, dead code. They've heard of guard clauses and explicit, parameters, and you're adding color onto, this is how to think about those. And here's how important these are as small building blocks. But one of them, I don't think a lot of developers have had conversations about normalizing symmetry. What's the bumper sticker? Normalizing symmetry. What does that mean?
If you have two things that are pretty similar, then it's really hard to unify them. But if you have two things that are exactly the same, then it's relatively easy to unify them.
Okay.
So if you have two things that are similar, a design move that you can make is to separate the parts that are different from the parts that are similar. If you continue that process just a little at a time, pulling out a helper class or helper function, eventually you'll have two things that are identical, and then you can bring them together if they really belong on top of each other. So that's noticing these moments of symmetry. Symmetry is a hint that there's some underlying structure that you just haven't quite uncovered yet. And part of the skill of the designer is the aesthetic sense to go, these are close together. And then there's two possible options. One is they're close together, but I can't see how to unify them. So I'm just going to let this go. I'm just going to take this moment, wish that I could do something to eliminate this duplication that doesn't need to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't have a path to unify them. But sometimes you just push a little harder and you can see how to make them exactly identical. And then why have two things that do exactly the same job? You don't need that anymore.
Yeah.
So that's, for me, that's normalizing symmetry. Symmetry is just this message the universe gives us about the implied order of things, and we just haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. When I was going through the list of the list of guidance in the book and going through the book, it caused an image to go through my head, because I've been doing, you've been doing software longer than I have, but I've still been coding for 25 years, which is longer than, the young guys. And there's certain things where if I let the code go too long, it becomes a bigger mountain to tackle later on, and sometimes impossible. And I think of the process of baking bread. Past a certain point, if I don't put in the right amount of salt, if I don't follow the recipe, and I go through a rise cycle after the kneading of the bread, now it's rising. Well, there's kind of a point where, you know what? I can't just go back to the beginning. I can't, insert random step after certain stages. And it made me think about some things in software where I let it go, and now I have users out there in the wild using the software in production, and now I want to change something structurally, but I didn't set it up to be flexible. Well, now I've got a bigger problem.
That puts you in an incredible bind because you have to make wise decisions that accurately predict the future in order to avoid those kind of problems coming down the pike. Except we know, one, today's the dumbest we'll ever be.
Mm-hmm.
And two, we can't predict the future. So thinking in that style, you've just tied your hands because you have to predict the future accurately or else.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't predict the future accurately. So what do you do in this empirical style? And the reason I use that word empirical is to contrast it with a couple of other styles. The style you're talking about, I would call speculative design,
Mm-hmm.
where we say, here's what I think is going to happen in the future. So I'm going to speculate and prepare the design for this uncertain future. The other is, let me call it reactive design, where you're like, oh, it's such a mess that I can't, I'm in a kitchen and it's just so filthy that if I don't clean off a little area of the counter, I can't even cook at all.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's optimal, either economically or in these relationship kind of terms that I'm talking about. So I want to work empirically. That is, as I develop the software, I say, oh, the design needs to do this because this kind of change is important and more difficult to do than it needs to be. So now I'm going to morph the design in the direction of the changes that actually turn out to happen. And I think that situation that you're talking about is actually what success looks like. You make some decisions, the best decisions you can.
Mm-hmm.
You don't do anything to damage your future on purpose, but you can't make decisions that make your future easy because you don't know what the future is going to be.
Yeah.
You may, what changes you want to make in the future, you don't know. And whatever you think the design ought to be today, tomorrow you're going to learn some lessons and that ideal picture is going to change.
Mm-hmm.
So what if we just embrace that? What makes that not a disaster is that design changes tend to be reversible.
Mm-hmm.
If we say, here we got these two class hierarchies and we unify them, and then we realize, this code is ugly, you can undo that kind of change. It may take you a little while, but you can undo changes to the structure of the software, generally speaking, in about the same amount of effort that it took you to make the changes in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
That is not true of the behavior of the system. If I send the IRS a bunch of reports with wrong numbers, it's way more expensive to get back to my base state than it would have been to just send the right numbers in the first place. Mm-hmm. But software design decisions tend to be reversible. And if that's true, and we can make these large changes in small, safe steps, then we can afford to just defer most of the design decisions to the future.
Yeah.
Some people hear that story and they're like, oh, you're just saying you don't do any design. I can't do any design up front. I'm like, no. When you start speculating, stop designing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Like if you say, well, I have to make 100 guesses before I can launch.
Mm-hmm.
No, you don't.
Right.
You like build the skills, build the relationships, build the teamwork, get started.
Yeah.
Be used to having this balance between changes to the behavior of the system and changes to the structure of the system. If all of that's true, then when that uncertain future comes true, you'll be able to apply your newfound skills to that uncertain future and do something that's, maybe it's not perfect, but it wouldn't have been perfect based on your 100 speculations either.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not actually worse, and it's considerably better in some ways. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, you preserve a lot of flexibility. Instead of making changes and hope you're right, you maximize and protect your flexibility every step of the way.
Yeah, and I would use the word optionality, especially if I'm talking to somebody with a finance background. I want to preserve optionality.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll include a link to this in the show notes, but your book also comes with a mailing list that you've started where you send out mailers and then people can kind of interact with you. And we'll include a link to that in the show notes. But one of the things that you've talked about, because I've joined it, is your experimentation with the GPT phase of AI on publications and what that might look like. And I'd like you to share what, however much, I know it's super secret, but what you'd like to share at this point on that.
It's not secret. It's just we're limited in the amount of feedback that we can usefully accommodate. So the project's called Rent a Kent. And the idea is to train a model on everything that I've ever written, which amounts to about 5 million tokens, something like that, and see how much better, and by better, I mean like me, how much better answers we can get to software development questions. So I'm not interested in training to explain to people about art or poker or folk music or something. This is specifically around software development. And one specific experiment is, as I write blog posts, we put out a version of the model that's prepared to answer questions about the blog post. So it's a little like a comment section, except it's a chat that's prepped to talk about the topic of the blog post that you just read. So we're in very much in experimental mode. Some of the answers are not words I've ever written, but I would agree with 100%. And some of the answers are just ludicrously bad. So we're still working on that part. But the goal is to see just how good we can make a language model at a particular topic from a particular perspective, namely mine.
That's so interesting because the algorithm or the GPT library or service, it's kind of just picking a component off the shelf. I'm choosing a third-party library. I'm choosing a third-party service. And the behavior is completely dependent on the underlying data that you're choosing. So what's your thought process when you're designing what it means to create tests for a piece of software with those kinds of dynamics?
Great question. And there are now some services that will do this, where you can give it question and answer pairs. You can use question and answer pairs as part of the training process, and you can give it question and actual answers, and the service will say, was the answer relevant? Was the answer concise? Was the ranks it in a bunch of different ways? Of course, it's some model coming up with those rankings. So it's all magic. So, writing, to me, putting words in a row that you're going to read in a row is one kind of skill. This is like writing, except it's kind of like programming, except it's non-deterministic. It feels like taking a pair of chopsticks and trying to turn the knobs on some machine and flip switches on this machine, except it's completely black and you can't see what the knobs are, much less know what they all do. So it's still like writing. In the end, there's words in a row that somebody's going to read, but there's a whole new set of skills, and I only have a few weeks worth of experience with it. So who knows where that's going to go?
Sure. But that seems like with this GPT era, it seems like there's some ideas which are obvious that if it plays out and if it can work well, that it would be useful to lots of people. And like yourself, people who've published and spoken at conferences and have a large body of teaching content or teaching data. Can we make a program that's interactive that kind of would say what this teacher would say? That could be useful for a lot
in
of
a variety of circumstances. Yeah, absolutely. The question isn't, is it going to be perfect? The question is, can we get it close enough?
Yeah.
So that the good experiences far outweigh the bad experiences, and the bad experiences don't get too bad.
Yeah. Right. Well, this is fascinating, and we'll make sure to include a link to that. Will the public be able to access this or not just yet?
Oh, absolutely. Go to rentakent.ai
Okay.
and you'll see what the current state of play is.
Awesome. Well, before we close out, recognizing that we've been doubling the number of programmers out there over the past, or for the past every 5 years for over a decade. There's just lots and I mean,
a lot longer than that.
Yeah, right. And so for those who weren't around anywhere near the time when the debates were raging around TDD and extreme programming, what would you say to the people that were starting out and haven't really dug in or gone through all of those gyrations? Any advice for the young developers?
So the debates still rage, but
Okay.
that's a topic we could probably talk about for hours by itself. If something's painful and it doesn't make sense, do something about it.
Yeah.
I think there's this masochistic streak in programmers. And that's the whole point of tidy first. You got some messy code, you want to change it, it's going to be painful. Well, maybe sometimes what you should do is make it so it's not going to be painful.
Mm-hmm.
And that moment seems to escape people. And that's true of all the activities that you do as a programmer, whether it's coding, building your own tools, exploring new technologies. If something's painful and it doesn't make sense, do something about it. I mean, sometimes work is hard. And, it's just they call it work for a reason. But, if you're waiting forever for code reviews, think about what you could do so that code reviews were redundant.
Yeah.
If your build cycle, takes hours, think about what a build cycle would look like that didn't take hours, that gave you the same confidence that your current build cycle does. If you're writing tests and then you have to change 100 tests at a time because they all break at the same time, think about what the test would have to look like so it wasn't like that. And think about what the design would have to look like so the tests didn't have to look like that.
Mm-hmm.
We all have more agency than we exercise. And that's the one thing. If the next generation learns that lesson, then we're good.
So true. There's still questions about, well, I don't think product management would approve or would approve us paying down some technical debt or taking some time to fix some things, but yet they haven't asked. They're assuming the answer is no, and they're assuming it's going to be a big deal.
Yeah, well, sometimes that assumption is correct, and it's still not what's best in everyone's best interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just pay attention to those pain points. That's the universe is telling you that something ought to change.
Yeah. Well, Kent, thanks so much for coming on the Azure DevOps podcast and sharing with us your new book, Tidy First, and also in extreme programming.
You forgot to lift at the end of it.
Oh, sorry about that. All right, won't happen again, sir. And we'll include a link to all your books that you've written and your website and rentakent.ai. Lots of good stuff. Go. All right, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.